This past Friday, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. You may have seen press coverage of this. Mainly, the media was interested in the fact that there was a big walkout. A whole bunch of the delegations that are anti-Israel walked out in dramatic fashion, and that's what got all the headlines. But regardless of who was or wasn't actually sitting in the room at the time, Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech made a number of points that will have serious political implications in the days, months, and years ahead. Right at the beginning of the speech, in the opening minutes, Prime Minister Netanyahu held up a map of the Middle East and talked about the achievements over the last 2 years in taking down Iran and its network of proxies. Have a look.
Here's where things stand today. Half the Houthi leadership in Yemen, gone. Yahya Sinwar in Gaza, gone. Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, gone. The Assad regime in Syria, gone. Those militias in Iraq, well, they're still deterred. And their leaders, if they attack Israel, will also be gone. And for Iran's top military commanders and its top atomic bomb scientists, well, they're gone too.
Before we go on, make sure to go into the description of this video below and download the free ebook that is available there. This is a collection of columns that I've published over the course of the last year and a half since the beginning of the October 7th war. It really gives you a feel, like almost like a diary, gives you a feel for everything we've been through in this war. So go ahead and download that ebook. This set the tone for the entire speech. You see here, Netanyahu was basically saying to the world, gone are the days of Israel turning a blind eye to the buildup of weapons and the buildup of armies on our borders that are designed to threaten the state of Israel by people who openly say that they want to destroy the state of Israel. From now on, Israel deals with the threats from our enemies and takes them out before they can pose any real danger. We saw this just 2 weeks ago. We made a video about it last week, how Israel bombed inside Syria because the Syrians were installing new anti-aircraft missiles that would have prevented Israel from having freedom of operation in the skies over the Middle East. And we've also seen it with Israel's operations in Lebanon, where for every violation of the ceasefire deal with Hezbollah, Israel goes in and enforces it. And Israel has been bombing every violation of that ceasefire agreement. And this is a big change from what used to be in the Middle East, where Israel would turn a blind eye to these violations. But then Prime Minister Netanyahu pivoted to what I believe is the most important and central theme of the speech.
Israel is fighting your fight. So I want to tell you a secret. Behind closed doors, many of the leaders who publicly condemn us privately thank us. They tell me how much they value Israel's superb intelligence services that have prevented time and again terrorist attacks in their capitals, time and again saving countless lives. General George Keegan, former head of U.S. Air Force Intelligence, once said, if the United States had to gather on its own the intelligence that Israel gives us, we would have to establish 5 CIAs. 5 CIAs. This past June, when Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities, German Chancellor Merz admitted the truth. He said, Israel is doing the dirty work for all of us.
So this is a message we've heard before, that Israel is fighting the enemies of the West, that Israeli intelligence helps Western nations fight terrorism. But then Prime Minister Netanyahu took this topic in a slightly different direction.
Yet over time, many world leaders buckled. They buckled under the pressure of a biased media, radical Islamist constituencies, and anti-Semitic mobs. There's a familiar saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Well, for many countries here, when the going got tough, you caved. And here's the shameful result of that collapse. For much of the past 2 years, Israel has had to fight a seven-front war against barbarism, with many of your nations opposing us. Astoundingly, as we fight the terrorists who murdered many of your citizens, you are fighting us. You condemn us, you embargo us, and you wage political and legal warfare, it's called lawfare, against us. I say to the representatives of those nations, this is not an indictment of Israel. It's an indictment of you. It's an indictment of weak-kneed leaders who appease evil rather than support a nation whose brave soldiers guard you from the barbarians at the gate. They're already penetrating your gates. When will you learn? You can't appease your way out of jihad, and you won't escape the Islamist storm by sacrificing Israel. To overcome that storm, you have to stand with Israel. But that's not what you're doing.
This is huge. You notice Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned the Islamist constituencies in these Western nations who are condemning Israel, that they're caving to. He mentioned the barbarians within their gates. He talked about the fact that they are losing a war against an Islamist takeover of their countries. This is no longer about the threat of Iranian ballistic missiles or of terrorist incidents that Israeli intelligence would help them prevent. This is about the fact that everyone knows that European nations, especially, are being taken over by Islamists. Native Europeans are not having children at a birth rate that comes anywhere near replacement level, and waves of Muslim immigrants into these countries are basically taking over. They're running for office, they're gaining power, their population is increasing. In most of these countries, there's not even been any legislation to prevent more and more waves of Muslim immigrants from coming in. Everyone in Europe knows that this is a major issue that threatens the very identity of Western civilization. Everyone realizes this, and here Prime Minister Netanyahu draws a direct line between that issue, the Islamist takeover of the West, and the war that Israel is fighting. And this is a very important change in messaging. European countries are losing a long war of attrition. The whole question is a matter of time. Let me put it this way. Ask yourself the following. Look at what's happening in Europe. What is the game plan to turn this around? What is the game plan for Christian or Western or Judeo-Christian, use whatever term you like, what is the game plan for Western civilization to actually gain back ground that has been lost and to push back and regain control and regain the identity of the West that is now being lost to an encroaching Islam? In different countries, Islam has taken over to varying degrees, but is there any way forward where we can see Christian, biblically based Western civilization making a comeback? This is a very dark time. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is drawing attention to the fact that the same nations that are terrified of the fact that they're losing their own identities are condemning Israel for fighting against jihadists who share the same ideology as those who are taking over these European countries. Prime Minister Netanyahu here was saying the truth, the quiet part out loud, that everyone knows and everyone is afraid to confront. A few minutes later, Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the Palestinian state issue. Now, he said a lot on the subject, calling out countries that have recognized a Palestinian state, but there were 2 points in particular that he emphasized that tell us a lot about the direction things may take in the days, months, and even years ahead. Have a look.
This week, the leaders of France, Britain, Australia, Canada, and other countries unconditionally recognized a Palestinian state. They did so after the horrors committed by Hamas on October 7th. Horrors praised on that day by nearly 90% of the Palestinian population. And let me say that again. Nearly 90% of Palestinians supported the attack on October 7th. It's not supported only, they celebrated it. They danced on the rooftops. They threw candies. That's both in Gaza and in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank as you call it.
Now, here, Prime Minister Netanyahu focused in on the fact that the Palestinian people overwhelmingly supported what Hamas did on October 7th. Polling still shows that there's overwhelming support for Hamas. We talked about this in our last video, that if an election were even held today in Gaza, Hamas would win in any election. They're still overwhelmingly popular. And what's so important about this point is that it blows up a lie, a myth that we've been told by politicians across the spectrum, including Israeli leadership, ever since the beginning of this war. And that lie is that the Palestinian people are actually anti-Hamas, and that Hamas is terrible for their own people, and that we need to liberate the Palestinian people from this tyranny of Hamas that oppresses them against their will. But this is not actually true, and this is a harsh reality that we need to face. That's what this whole speech was about. It was about facing up to harsh realities. It was about saying the quiet part, the uncomfortable part out loud. And one of the most uncomfortable facts about the current situation that we face is that the Palestinian people are still, with everything, supportive of Hamas. They're still supportive of genocide against the Jewish people and the complete destruction of the state of Israel. And what that means is that any way forward that sees a peaceful resolution of a conflict, any way forward that sees coexistence between the citizens of the state of Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, the Arabs who live in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, is going to require an overhaul of the education system. It's going to require unflinching Israeli control over all security concerns. There will not be any tolerance for any kind of terrorism. Prime Minister Netanyahu then went on to call out the Palestinian Authority by name, referring to the fact that they support terrorism, that they pay the families of terrorists, and that they use the same textbooks as Hamas, indoctrinating their children to hate Israel. And of course, they promise that they're going to reform. And all the calls for a Palestinian state that we heard in the headlines over the last few weeks have all said that the Palestinian Authority is going to go through reforms. But what Prime Minister Netanyahu was doing in this speech was saying, we're no longer going to accept empty promises. We're no longer going to accept commitments in advance to change things, to reform. And this is a harsh reality that we're all going to have to face. In the days and months ahead, as the world starts turning its attention to the day after plan in the Gaza Strip, and the question of who's going to govern the Gaza Strip, and what is a path forward where Israel is secure and there's a chance to actually live in peace and harmony with our neighbors, we have to look reality in the eye. We can no longer deny the fact that the Palestinian people seek the destruction of the state of Israel overwhelmingly. They seek the genocide of the Jewish people overwhelmingly. A two-state solution with an independent Palestinian state under the current Palestinian Authority is simply a non-starter. It does not mean that there will be peace between Israel and its neighbors. And here Prime Minister Netanyahu was putting the world on notice that the Palestinian Authority, who they all still believe is a partner in peace and could govern, is not an option. So this is going to have big policy implications in the days ahead.
I believe that in the coming years, the Middle East will look dramatically different. Many of those who wage war on Israel today will be gone tomorrow. Brave peacemakers will take their place. And nowhere will this be more true than in Iran. The long-suffering Iranian people will regain their freedom. They will make Iran great again. And our two ancient peoples, the people of Israel and the people of Iran, will restore a friendship that will benefit the entire world.
Let's make no mistake about it. This was not Prime Minister Netanyahu painting some rosy picture of the future, hoping for a day when finally the Iranian people will be free. He was laying out an agenda item. He was telling the world that taking down the Iranian regime is still a priority, as it should be. This is a regime that chants death to Israel, death to America. And it's not just a slogan. They have invested hundreds of billions of dollars while they impoverish their own people, building up these vast armies to surround the state of Israel, working on their nuclear program, and it's all in order to destroy the state of Israel. So of course, Israel has every justification to want to take down the Iranian regime. But it's about much more than Israel's own security. Think back to everything else in this speech. What Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying is that taking down the Iranian regime will actually deliver a defeat to the forces of jihad. We talked a few minutes ago about what's happening in Europe and how Islamism is on the march, and they're taking over European cities and European countries, and they're riding high. And meanwhile, Israel is fighting them kinetically. Israel's fighting a war against the same Islamic forces of jihad. And what Prime Minister Netanyahu is telling the world is that the only way to defeat jihad is to actually defeat it. And it might go down as one of the great mistakes of the last year, of our era, that in the 12-day war, tragically, President Trump, under domestic pressure, then pressured the Israelis to stop the war and stop short of actually bringing down the Iranian regime. You see, bringing down the Iranian regime would not just remove the mullahs from power. It would not just liberate what is actually a pretty pro-Western people, the Iranian people. Let's not forget that before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, before the Islamists took over, there were daily flights from Tel Aviv to Tehran. This was a country that was at peace with Israel. That population is still there. It's a fairly pro-Western and pro-Israel population. So this is not only about taking down the Iranian regime and turning Iran in that massive landmass into a peaceful nation, which would change the Middle East forever, but it's also about delivering a defeat to the forces of jihad. Because the only way forward, the only way that those of us who believe in Western values, those of us who believe in the values that come from the Bible, the only way that our civilization is going to survive and is going to be victorious is to actually deliver a defeat to the forces of jihad. And taking down the Iranian regime would do exactly that. Now, just to sum up the key takeaways of this speech that we've talked about. Number one, Israel's enemies are the enemies of the West, and not only in the military sense, in the sense of terror threats, but in the sense of the cultural takeover by Islamism, by jihadism, by Sharia supremacy as it takes over Western nations. Israel is fighting the same enemies that threaten the West. Point number two, any conversations about coexistence with the Palestinian Arabs, any conversations about a day after plan for the Gaza Strip is going to have to be based on reality. And reality is that the Palestinian people are indoctrinated to a genocidal jihadist ideology. They are still very supportive of Hamas, and any hope for coexistence is going to have to include ironclad security control by Israel and perhaps decades of re-education of this radicalized population. And finally, that regime change in Iran, taking down the Islamist jihadist mullah regime, is still very much a priority for the state of Israel, as it should be. And it also should be for the entire Western world, because delivering a defeat to the forces of jihad is the only path forward to start making gains and bringing victory to the West as a whole.